One creature slammed into him, claws ripping across his armor, tearing flesh beneath. Daniel staggered, blood spilling down his side. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand, but Kaylira could see the strain in his movements, the heaviness in his steps. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice breaking. He did not look at her. He drove his knife into the beast's throat, then shoved the body aside. "Stay inside," he shouted again, his voice shaking now with pain. But Kaylira could not stay still. Not this time. For years she had been told she was useless. For years she had believed it. But as she watched Daniel bleed, still fighting for her, something inside her snapped. She could not, she would not, hide in silence while he fell. She ran from her chamber, down the spiraling stairs, her bare feet striking the cold stone. At the bottom, she seized a fallen Vathran spear, ornamental, left forgotten in the tower as if even weapons had abandoned her. The wood felt strange in her hands, heavy and foreign, but she gripped it tight. When she burst into the courtyard, the night was chaos. Daniel was on his knees, a beast looming above him, claws raised for the kill. Without thought, Kaylira lunged, the spear drove forward, piercing through the creature's chest. Its screech split the air as it collapsed, black blood spraying across the stones. Kaylira stood over Daniel, her chest heaving, the spear shaking in her hands. For the first time in her life, she had struck back. Daniel looked up at her, blood on his lips, eyes wide with shock. "Princess." But before he could speak further, another wave came, the courtyard filled with shadows. Kaylira tightened her grip on the spear and planted her feet beside him. "I will not hide," she whispered. Side by side they fought, Daniel with rifle and knife, Kaylira with spear. She was untrained, her movements wild, but fury guided her arms. Each strike was fueled by years of shame, by the weight of exile, by the burning truth that she would no longer be silent. One creature slashed her arm, pain lancing through her, but she did not stop. Another tried to tear Daniel from her side, and she drove her spear clean through its throat. Together they held the line. At last, when dawn broke over the horizon, the ground was littered with broken bodies. The swarm retreated into the sky, their shrieks fading with the rising sun. Kaylira stood panting, her gown torn, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Daniel collapsed to the ground, clutching his wound. She dropped to her knees beside him, catching his head before it struck the stone. His blood stained her hands. "You are not alone," she whispered, her voice fierce through her tears. His lips moved, barely forming words. "Neither are you." And in that moment, amidst blood and ruin, Kaylira felt something ignite inside her. No longer the barren jewel, no longer the exiled daughter. She had fought. She had stood. For the first time, she felt alive. The courtyard was silent after the storm. The swarm's bodies lay scattered across the stones, dark blood steaming in the cold morning air. Broken wings twitched, then stilled. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavy. Kaylira knelt on the ground, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she held Daniel against her. His armor was torn, his side bleeding freely, but his eyes were still open. Blue eyes, steady even in pain. "You fought," he whispered, his voice raw. "You fought like fire." Tears blurred her vision. "Because you fought for me." Daniel tried to smile, but the effort made him wince. "We fought together." Kaylira pressed her hand to his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. The warm blood soaked through her fingers, staining her silver skin crimson. Her heart pounded in fear. She had seen death before, but never so close, never of someone she could not bear to lose. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "Do not leave me now." His eyes fluttered. "I'm not leaving, not as long as you're here." When the healers finally came, summoned by the smoke and signals Daniel had lit before the attack, they found a princess covered in blood and a human soldier half dead in her arms. They rushed him inside, binding his wounds, pouring medicines into him. Kaelira refused to leave his side. For hours she sat in silence, watching his chest rise and fall, fearing it might stop. Every so often his hand would twitch and she would catch it in hers, whispering words she had never spoken aloud before. "You saved me. You gave me strength when I had none. Do not take that away now." The healers assured her he would live, but Kaelira did not trust their promises. She stayed by his bed through the night, eyes burning with exhaustion yet unable to close them. At dawn his voice stirred her from her vigil. "You're still here," he murmured weakly. Her throat tightened. "Where else would I be?" Daniel's cracked lips curved faintly. "Most would have left. Most would have called me just another soldier. But you stayed." Kaelira leaned closer, her voice fierce. "Because you stayed when no one else did. Because you saw me, Daniel Holt. Not a broken jewel, not a useless exile. Me." His eyes softened. "Then promise me something." Her heart trembled. "What?" "Don't let them take that from you again. Don't let them tell you you're nothing." Kaelira closed her eyes. For years she had let those words, barren, cursed, worthless, burn scars into her soul. She had bowed under their weight until she almost believed them. "But no more." "I promise," she whispered. In the days that followed, the court came to see what had happened. Messengers carried the story. The forgotten princess and the human soldier had stood against the swarm and lived. The royal guards looked at Kaelira with wide eyes, not as an exile but as a warrior. Yet Kaelira barely noticed them. Her world had narrowed to the chamber where Daniel lay healing. She brought him water, helped him sit, listened to his stories when the pain kept him awake at night. She laughed at his clumsy jokes even when they made little sense. And when silence fell between them, it was no longer heavy. It was comfort. One evening, as the sun sank low, Daniel spoke softly. "When I was bleeding out, I thought that was it. But then you were there. You didn't run, you chose to fight. That choice saved me." Kaelira shook her head. "It was not courage, it was fear. Fear of losing you." Daniel reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "That's still a choice. And it's the bravest one you could have made." She stared at their joined hands, her heart aching with something new, something both terrifying and beautiful. For years, she had lived in silence, waiting for death or forgetting. Now, for the first time, she was living because of someone. And in that moment, Kaelira knew her truth. She was no longer the barren princess, no longer the castaway in the tower. She was Kaelira who chose to stand. Kaelira who fought beside a human soldier. Kaelira who would never again bow to the chains of shame. Her people could see her however they wished, but she had already chosen who she was, and she had chosen to never stand alone again. The tower that had once been a prison was no longer silent. It had become a place of whispers, not of shame, but of awe. The tale spread quickly, how the forgotten princess had stood against the swarm, how she had fought beside a human soldier and lived. When the royal court arrived, they did not find a fragile exile hiding in her chamber. They found Kaelira standing at the gates of her tower, her gown torn, her arm bandaged but her silver eyes steady. Beside her, leaning on a cane but unbroken, stood Daniel Holt. The nobles whispered among themselves. Some were shocked. Some were doubtful. Others, for the first time, were ashamed. For years they had mocked her as barren, as broken. Yet here she was, alive when many of their warriors had fallen. Her father, the king, stepped forward. His crown gleamed, his robe trailed behind him, but his eyes held uncertainty. For years he had turned away from his daughter. Now, faced with the truth of her courage, he struggled to speak. "My child," he said at last, his voice heavy. "Why did you risk your life?" Kaelira lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, but it carried like a bell. "Because life is not measured by heirs or bloodlines. Life is measured by the choices we make. And I chose to stand." The court fell into silence. No one dared answer her. Beside her, Daniel straightened, his hand brushing the wound at his side. His blue eyes swept the nobles with quiet fire. He said nothing, but his presence spoke loudly enough. This fragile human, this outsider, had bled for their princess when no one else had. The king's mouth opened as if to protest, but Kaelira did not wait. For the first time, she did not bow her head to his judgment. She turned away from the court and walked back toward her tower, Daniel steady at her side. That was the moment her people began to see her differently. In the weeks that followed, stories of the Princess of the Tower spread across Vaethra. Not as the Barren jewel, but as the warrior who had faced the swarm. Her name carried in marketplaces, in taverns, in the quiet songs of children. For the first time, her people spoke it with pride. But Kaelira did not live for their approval anymore. She had learned that worth could not be granted by a crown or stolen by whispers. It lived in her own choices. She spent her days walking the cliffs with Daniel, her nights listening to his songs. He grew stronger each day, though the scar on his side remained as a mark of their battle. Sometimes, when the pain flared, she sat with him in silence, holding his hand until the storm passed. And sometimes, when he looked at her, Kaelira felt something bloom inside her chest, something far greater than the sorrow she had carried for so long. It was not the love her people expected of her, not a bond of duty or bloodline. It was something truer. At night, when the winds whipped across the tower and the waves crashed below, Kaelira would hear his voice, soft, low, carrying words she did not understand. The songs were simple, nothing like the grand music of her people, but they were alive in a way that made her chest ache. Finally, one evening, curiosity overcame her pride. She leaned over the railing and asked, "Why do you sing?" Daniel looked up, surprised. The last light of the suns caught his scarred face, and for a moment she saw how young he truly was beneath the marks of war. He tilted his head, then gave a small smile. "Because it reminds me I'm alive." Kaelira frowned. "Alive? You're alive already." He shook his head gently. "No. Breathing isn't the same as living. Singing reminds me there's more than war, more than fear. It reminds me there's something worth holding on to." His words struck her in a way she could not explain. She turned away, retreating into her chamber. But all that night she lay awake, hearing his song echo in her mind. Days passed and she found herself speaking more. Small questions at first. Where was he from? What was his world like? Daniel answered patiently. He told her of Earth, not as a grand empire, but as a place of oceans and forests, of cities built by stubborn hands, of skies filled with storms and stars. He told her of people who failed and tried again, people who were fragile yet unbroken. Kaelira listened. Sometimes she laughed softly at his strange words, his simple descriptions. Earth sounded chaotic, messy, nothing like the perfect crystal halls of Vaethra. But there was warmth in his voice when he spoke, a warmth she had never heard when her own family spoke of their home. In return, Daniel asked about her. Not about her barrenness, no, he never once mentioned it. Instead, he asked what she loved as a child, what stories her mother told her, what food she missed from the feasts of the court. No one had asked her those things in years. Slowly, Kaelira found herself answering. She spoke of running through crystal gardens as a girl, of touching the glowing flowers that opened only under moonlight. She spoke of the great library, where she had hidden among the scrolls, reading tales of warriors and queens. Daniel listened with quiet attention, as though every word mattered, as though she mattered. One evening, as the sea turned black beneath the stars, Kaelira admitted something she had never told another soul. "My people call me broken," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They say I have no worth because I cannot give life." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he set down his weapon and looked up at her with steady eyes. "That's stupid," he said simply. Her silver eyes widened. Stupid. Yes, Daniel said. Where I come from, worth isn't measured by what you can or can't give. It's measured by the choices you make, by what you stand for. You're still here, aren't you? Still standing, even after all they've done. That's not weakness, that's strength. Kalira's throat tightened. No one had ever said such words to her. For years, she had carried the weight of shame like a chain around her neck. Now, with a single blunt sentence, this human soldier had cracked it open. She turned her face away, blinking back tears. But for the first time in years, the tower did not feel like a prison. It felt alive. And for the first time in her life, Kalira wondered if perhaps she was not as broken as they said. The tower had once been silent, like a tomb. Now it carried voices. Soft ones at first, drifting through the halls like new light. Questions, stories, even laughter. Kalira found herself waiting for Daniel's footsteps outside, listening for his steady humming as if it were a promise that she was not alone. She had not meant to open her heart to him. She had lived so long behind walls of silence that her words felt heavy, locked away. But the human soldier had a strange power. He never demanded, never pried. He only listened. And that quiet patience began to draw the truth out of her piece by piece. One night the moons of Vaethra rose together, spilling silver across the sea. Kalira stood on the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart full of shadows. Below, Daniel leaned against the stones, cleaning his weapon as he always did. She felt the ache inside her growing until it could no longer be swallowed. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked up. "Yes, Princess?" Her fingers tightened on the railing. "Do you know why I live in this tower?" He set the weapon aside. His gaze was calm. "I guessed it was not by choice." She gave a bitter laugh. "Not by choice. Never by choice." She turned her eyes back to the sea, her voice low and trembling. "I was cast here. Exiled. Not for treason, not for weakness in battle. For something worse, at least in the eyes of my people." Daniel waited. He did not interrupt. Kalira swallowed. The words were sharp in her throat. "I am barren. My body will never give children. And to my people, that means I am worthless, a jewel that cannot shine, a vessel with no purpose." My father looked at me and saw only failure. My mother stopped calling me daughter. The court whispered that I was cursed, and so they locked me away, where no one would have to see the shame of me. The confession broke from her like a wound torn open. She clutched the railing, her silver skin glowing in the moonlight, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "For years I have carried this. I told myself it was true, that I was nothing, less than nothing. I stopped dressing in colors, stopped singing, stopped dreaming. Because what use is beauty without worth? What use is a life that cannot give life?" The waves roared below, filling the silence. Daniel's voice rose against them, steady and firm. "That's stupid." Kalira turned sharply, stunned. "What?" He rose to his feet, meeting her gaze. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce. "That's stupid," he repeated. "What they told you, what you believed, all of it." Her breath caught. No one had ever dismissed her curse so bluntly. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but strong. "Where I come from, worth isn't measured by what's in your blood, not by what your body can or can't do. Worth is in the choices you make, the courage you carry. You've been standing here for years carrying a weight that would have crushed anyone else. That's not failure, that's strength." Kalira's chest tightened. "Strength? To stand alone in silence?" "To survive," Daniel said. "To still be here. They abandoned you, but you didn't give in. That matters more than any child you could bear. Don't let them tell you otherwise." The tears she had been holding back finally slipped down her cheeks. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her body trembling. No one had ever said such things to her. Not once in all the years of exile had anyone spoken to her as if she were whole. Her voice shook. "You cannot know what it feels like, to be cast aside by those who were meant to love you." Daniel's expression softened. You're wrong. I know it well. Kalira blinked, startled. He looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening. Back on Earth, I wasn't anyone special. Just another face in a broken family. My father drank himself into silence. My mother left when I was a boy. Nobody expected much of me. I joined the army because it was the only place I could stand. On my own feet, the only place where I mattered. His voice grew quieter. So don't think you're the only one who knows what it means to be abandoned. The air between them trembled with unspoken pain. Kalira stared at him, her heart twisting. For the first time, she saw not just a soldier, but a man scarred by more than battle. She whispered, "Then why? Why do you still sing?" Daniel's gaze returned to her, steady as the tide. "Because if I don't, then the silence wins, and I refuse to let it." Kalira's tears fell freely now, but they were not only of sorrow. Somewhere in the ache of her chest, a spark of warmth stirred. A fragile, dangerous thing. Hope. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a broken jewel. She felt like a flame that refused to die, and all because a human soldier had looked at her and spoken the truth. The nights around the tower had grown quieter in recent weeks. The war felt far away, only whispers carried by messengers. Kalira almost allowed herself to believe that the storm of battle would never reach her lonely cliff. But war never forgets. It came suddenly. The sky split with shrieks. Black shapes poured from the stars, blotting out the pale glow of the twin moons. Wings like jagged blades beat against the air, and claws gleamed in the moonlight. The swarm had found the tower. Kalira's heart froze. She had seen sketches of the creatures in the old scrolls, monstrous forms of shadow and bone, but seeing them with her own eyes was like looking into a nightmare. Their mouths opened wider than they should, filled with rows of teeth. There, screeches pierced the air until the stones themselves seemed to shake. Below, Daniel was already moving. He snatched up his rifle, his body shifting into a rhythm carved by endless battles. There was no hesitation, no fear. Only purpose. "Stay inside," he shouted up at her. His voice was raw, but firm. Kalira stood frozen on the balcony, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The first wave of swarm dove, and Daniel met them with fire. His rifle roared, spitting bursts of light into the night. One creature fell, then another, crashing to the rocks below. But more came, wings blotting out the stars. The air stank of blood and burning flesh. Daniel fought like a storm, shifting, firing, reloading with movements as smooth as breath. His knife flashed when the creatures got too close, tearing through chitin and sinew. For every strike they landed, he answered with fury. But the swarm was endless. The palace of Vaethra was carved from crystal mountains, glowing like frozen fire under two golden suns. Its towers shone so brightly that travelers from distant worlds often thought the city was built of starlight itself. Within those walls, songs of glory and power filled the air. The people of Vaethra were proud, their voices rising in honor of kings, queens, and heirs to the throne. But behind those shining walls, behind the endless feasts and the whispers of politics, there was one figure who did not belong. Princess Kalira. Kalira had been born with all the marks of greatness. She was tall, her silver skin carrying the light of the suns as though she herself was a shard of heaven. Her hair fell in waves of pale blue, her eyes gleamed like polished steel. When she walked among her people as a child, they had bowed deeply, speaking of her as a future queen. She was meant to be the jewel of her father's reign, a daughter who would carry the bloodline forward into eternity. But fate had denied her. When she came of age, healers whispered the truth. Her body was barren. No child would ever grow in her womb, no heir would ever carry her name. Among the Vaethran people, this was not just misfortune, it was shame. The worth of a royal was not measured only in beauty or wisdom, it was measured in legacy. To be barren was to be broken. At first, the court tried to hide it. They silenced the healers. They smiled as Kalira sat in the grand halls, dressed in shining silks, But rumors always find air, and soon the truth spread like wildfire. Through the crystal streets, useless, cursed. A jewel without light. The whispers grew sharper, crueler, until they became daggers. No suitor came forward. No counselor spoke her name with respect. Even the servants, once eager to serve her, lowered their eyes and hurried past. Her father, the king, did not rage. That was worse. He only sighed when he looked at her as though she were a weight, dragging his crown lower. Her mother, once warm, grew distant, her embraces fading into cold politeness. Finally, one day, they told her, she would not sit in the great hall any longer. She would not walk with the other royals. She was to live in a high tower at the edge of the kingdom, where she could cause no shame, where she would not remind the court of what had been lost. They called it an act of mercy. To Kalira, it was exile. The tower stood on a cliff overlooking the endless sea. From its windows, the horizon stretched forever, waves rolling like blue glass. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also lonely. The only voices were the gull-like birds that cried overhead, circling the cliffs as if mocking her isolation. Days blurred into weeks and weeks into years. She walked the halls of the tower alone, her bare feet echoing on polished stone. She sang to herself sometimes, soft songs of her childhood, but even those began to fade when she realized no one was listening. Every mirror was a punishment. She still carried beauty, still shone like a jewel, but what did it matter? To her, people, she was already cracked, and so she began to believe it. She stopped dressing in bright colors. She stopped weaving jewels into her hair. She wore simple gowns, plain and unadorned, as though trying to make herself smaller, invisible. At night she stood by the window, staring at the stars. The same stars her ancestors had claimed as their destiny. She whispered to them, asking why she had been made this way, why she had been given a crown of shame instead of one of light. No answer came, only the waves below crashing endlessly, reminding her how small she was. The world still celebrated the royal line. Feasts were held, marriages were made, children were born. But none of it touched her. She was forgotten, locked away in a tower of shining stone. And in her silence, Kalira began to wonder if perhaps they were right. Perhaps she truly was nothing. The peace of Vaethra did not last forever. Even while Kalira sat alone in her tower, the stars burned with conflict. Far beyond the crystal mountains and shining seas, shadows moved. They were called the Swarm. Creatures without mercy, without voices, only hunger. They came like storms through the galaxies, wings darkening suns, claws ripping through steel and flesh. Entire worlds fell silent when their shadows passed. When the swarm reached the edges of Vaethran space, the people panicked. The proud warriors of the crystal world readied their weapons, their fleets, their shining armor. But even their brilliance could not hold back the endless tide. For every swarm creature burned in plasma fire, 10 more seemed to rise. Vaethra sent a desperate call into the void. Help us, and Earth answered. The humans came in ships that were not graceful like Vaethran vessels, but sturdy, scarred, built with purpose. They were a younger species, not as ancient or proud, but they were fierce. Fierce in ways that surprised even their allies. They fought with grit, with fire, with a will that refused to bend. At first, Kalira heard only whispers of them. Alone in her tower, she was not invited to councils or war rooms. But she caught fragments from the guards who passed by her gates, speaking in awe of these small, fragile-looking humans who threw themselves against monsters twice their size and came back bloodied but victorious. Still, none of it touched her life. She remained a shadow in her lonely home. Until one day, everything changed. The war had spread too close to the heart of the kingdom. Reports came of swarm creatures slipping past defenses, raiding outlying regions. The royal court, worried about the shame of losing a princess, even one they had discarded, decided to send protection to her tower. Not out of love, not out of care, but out of duty, and so, one soldier was assigned, not a shining knight of Vaethra, not one of their silver-armored generals. No, a human. His name was Sergeant Daniel Holt. The first time Kalira saw him, she almost laughed. He was nothing like the men of her people. Humans were smaller, rougher, with skin of clay colors instead of silver. Daniel stood in plain armor, scratched from battle. His hair was dark, cut short, his face marked with old scars. His eyes, however, were steady, blue as the deepest sea and sharp with focus. He bowed not with elegance but with the stiff motion of a soldier. "Princess Kalira," he said, his voice low but firm, "I am here to guard you." Kalira tilted her head, surprised, at the sound of his tongue. The humans had learned her people's language. Still, she frowned. "Guard me? From what?" Daniel's lips tightened. "From everything that wants you dead." She almost laughed again, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't joking. He wasn't there to flatter, or to speak like a courtier. He was there to fight. At first she ignored him. What was one human to her? Just another reminder that she was not trusted to stand on her own, not even in exile. She let him sit at the base of her tower, polishing his rifle, cleaning his knife, humming strange songs in a tongue she did not know. But when night fell and the winds howled, she found herself listening. His humming was soft, almost sad, yet steady, like the heartbeat of someone who refused to surrender. Days passed. Kalira sometimes looked down from her balcony, watching him eat strange rations, watching him carve little marks into a piece of metal, one for each day he had survived. He never complained, never spoke unless spoken to. He simply stayed. And for Kalira, who had been abandoned by everyone she loved, that simple act was more powerful than she wished to admit. One evening, when the sun sank low and painted the sea and fire, Kalira finally asked, "Why do you sing?" Daniel looked up, surprised. For a moment he was silent, as though weighing whether to answer. Then he smiled faintly. "Because it reminds me I'm alive, and as long as I'm alive, there's hope. Hope." The word struck her heart, a word she had almost forgotten. For years, Kalira had lived as if she were already dead, a shadow trapped in a tower. And yet, here was this human, scarred, weary, far from his own world, still daring to sing. She turned away quickly, hiding the sting in her eyes. But later, when she lay alone in her chamber, the word echoed in her mind. Hope. For the first time in a long while, she wondered if perhaps her story was not yet over. The tower was no longer as silent as before. Kalira still walked the empty halls, still stood by the high window staring out at the sea. But now she always knew there was someone below, a soldier, a human. Daniel Holt was not like her people. Vaethran guards carried themselves with pride, polished like ornaments in their shining armor. They spoke in measured words, always careful, always proper. But Daniel was different. He was plain, almost rough. His boots left muddy tracks when he returned from his patrols. He leaned against the walls of the tower like it belonged to him, and sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, he laughed. Not a polite, courtly laugh, but a loud, human laugh that startled the birds from the cliffs. Kalira had not heard laughter in her home for years. At first, she watched him with suspicion. From her balcony, she would see him eating from metal tins, his strange human food steaming in the cold air. She would see him polishing his rifle, running cloth across its surface again and again as though the act gave him peace. She wondered if he even noticed her gaze. For weeks he never spoke unless she did. It puzzled her. Her own people, even when they hated her, had always spoken at her either with venom or with pity. But this human seemed to know silence, seemed to respect it. And yet he sang,